All right.
All right, great. All right, Jake, you there? Hi, Jake.
Hey, what's going on?
Honey, good, good.
How you
Great to see
doing?
you.
You too.
Okay, so we'll get started. So we're going to focus tonight. Hi, Sally. How are you? Uh, we're going to focus tonight on four key stories that connect the books of Shemot and the book of Yehoshua. Sefer Shemot, the story of the Exodus in Sefer Shemot, primarily, and the book of Yehoshua, of Joshua in general. And what we want to talk about, we want to understand what happened in the splitting of the sea primarily, but we also want to understand the whole package, how we look at things in general. So I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be eye-opening and exciting. And God willing, we'll share some ideas and questions and thoughts. And I hope there'll be a lot of that. Jeanette, welcome. Good to see you.
Hi, Ricky.
Great to see you. All right, so we're going to start out with a very unusual love story. Some of you may be familiar with part of it. I'll tell you the rest of it. And so you may remember that when Yoshua first enters the land of Israel, he sends two spies to check out the city of Jericho, of Jericho. And en route to the city, well, when they first get there, they're spotted. And Rahav, who's a harlot, takes them in and protects them. When the soldiers of the city come to her home, she had a home in the wall of the city. When they come to her home, she sends them up to the roof and she hides them under some foliage on the roof. And then she tells the soldiers they ran out, leave now, and follow them outside the city and try to get outside the city before they close the doors of the city. So leave now and chase them. The soldiers leave, run outside the city, and she effectively saves them and hides them. After the soldiers leave, she tells them to stay the night. And then she makes the following representation to them. She says, listen, I saved your lives when you come and conquer the city because the power of God is very well known and clear. People see what Akadosh Baruch Hu is doing and what he's done with Sihon and Og, some of the nations that he already took out. When the time comes and you come back here, you owe me. Pledge to me that you'll save me and my family. And they say, great. Just tie a cloth on the outside window because her window was on the wall of the city. Once we see that cloth tied on the outside of the window, we'll make sure not to attack your home. But remember, they say, anybody who leaves the home is open game. And if the ribbon isn't there on the window, we're coming in. Good. So what does she do? She does that ultimately. If you remember, the city is surrounded by Jews, surrounded several times.
Turn off your video.
We walk around the city once each day for 6 days, and then walk around 7 times on Shabbat. Blow the trumpets, the walls of the city collapse, the Jewish soldiers go in and wipe out the city. But for Rachav, this lady, this harlot, and her family. Great stories written in the text straight away. We made a deal. She saved the lives of the spies, and it's the right thing to do. And it would be done again. But then our rabbis bring something fascinating. They say, wait a second, everybody. Remember the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt, and all that led up to it. And what goes on in the book of Yehoshua are intimately connected. They're very, very copy paste to the extent that remember that harlot Rahav who saved these spies. She and her family become part of the Jewish people. She converts. She marries who, of all people, the king of the Jewish people at the time, Yoshua, and she has two daughters with him. Okay, if the story ended there, it would be a mind blower. One second. A lady who was a harlot, who the soldiers happened onto her home, probably because of what her vocation was, to find refuge there, because anybody could go in and find refuge there. She ends up saving them. She joins the Jewish people, her and all of her family. She converts to Judaism as they do, and she marries Yoshua, Joshua the king. Great. If that were the end of the story, that would be great. But our rabbis go further and they say, wait a second. Remember that Yoshua is the Gilgul, is the reincarnation of Yosef HaSadiq. Yoshua, Joshua, is the
I didn't know that.
reincarnation. Right, Lisa? Great one.
I didn't know that. That's
That's a
great.
great one. Wait, it gets better. It gets better. Rachav, this harlot, is the reincarnation of Eshet Potiphar. Who is she? She's the woman that seduced Joseph, who he fought off. Right? Now, they end up back together. Yosef only had boys in Egypt. They end up back together, have two daughters, and the great great granddaughter of theirs is Huldah HaNavi'ah. Who is Huldah HaNavi'ah? She was one of the few female prophetesses. She lives during the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. She's married to a guy named Shalom ben Tikvah. The reason that's interesting is because she becomes a prophetess, our rabbis say, because of the righteousness of her husband. What does her husband Shalom do? He sits at the gates of the city and keeps refilling water in jugs so that when people come from a long trip and they're tired and they're thirsty and they're whatever, he provides them all the water they need. And our rabbis say, as a result of his righteousness, she becomes a prophetess. That's a pretty big thing by itself. But okay, she's a prophetess, the great granddaughter of Yoshua and Rachav, who are the Gilgulim, the reincarnations of Yosef and Eshet Potiphar. What does she end up doing? She's the one who Yoshiao, the king, calls upon when they find the Sefer Torah in the Beit HaMikdash, and Shafan HaSofer, one of the well-known scribes at the time, reads parts of the Sefer Torah to Yoshia, to the king, and Yoshia realizes that the people are worshiping idols, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take his retribution. So who does he call? Huldah. And he says, Huldah, what should we do? We saw what God has in store for us. What do? And Huldah tells them to get rid of the idol worship, to make teshuvah, which they do, and they save the generation. Now, so headline, story number one. There's an absolute intimate connectedness between what transpired in Egypt, how the Jewish people grew, what they were becoming, and the narrative in the book of Yoshua, to the extent where the leader in Egypt, Yosef, and the leader of the Jewish people, and what will come to be known, and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, the greatest generation in Jewish history, the generation of Joshua, they end up getting together with people you would never expect, people you would never imagine, marrying them and building remarkably from them. So, story A, very unusual love story, and enables us to begin to connect the dots between the story of Egypt and the story of Yeshua, which is the first generation in the land. Thoughts, questions so far? Hey, Sam. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. Interrupt anytime. Any questions are very welcome. Next interesting story. When Moshe Rabbeinu goes to the burning bush, and he sees this bush that has fire in it that's not consumed by fire, as we know. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha.
Take off your shoes.
Beautiful, Lisa. What does it really mean? What does Shal na'alecha mean? Mark, any ideas? Any thoughts?
Free your mind.
Huh? Shal na'alecha. What does it mean? Now, to give you another hint, okay? Because to give you another hint, the same exact language is used with Yoshua. Again, absolute identical lineup. After Yoshua comes into the land, after a major event happens for him, which we'll talk about in a minute, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him the same thing. Shal na'alecha, literally speaking, remove your shoes from your feet. Mark, what do you say? You got to unmute. No? All right, when you're ready. Jeanette, what do you think? What are we talking about?
I was going to say maybe like cleanse yourself, like
Purify yourself.
everything from your.
Right. Purify yourself, cleanse yourself.
Open your mind. Open your mind.
There you go. Who said that?
Baby.
Abe, grand slam, honey. Open your mind. What is it? What is it? Shal na'alecha, the na'al is in Tanakh terminology is the physical body, the physical domain of the person. Shal na'alecha means remove your constrictions, your physical constrictions, step beyond them, and do what, Abe? What
Open
happens
your mind.
Open your mind and allow what? And allow HaKadosh Baruch Hu inside, prophetically, to give you as much as he can possibly give. So what do we say in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu? We say he was ambivalent and he did it somewhat. He didn't do it fully, and he doesn't fully do it until later on. But Yoshua, when he's confronted, he stands there in front of Malach Hashem, this angel. He asks him, friend or foe? The angel says friend. And then we believe that Yoshua has the ability to step beyond his physical constructs and engage HaKadosh Baruch Hu on a fully intellectual, spiritual level. Just like Moshe. Not quite on the level that Moshe ultimately achieves, but certainly on a remarkable level. So story number 2 that connects the first page of Jewish exodus and growth and development to the second page is this remarkable opportunity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to the leader of the generation to move beyond his physical constructs and be able to meet God on an altogether different level. Good so far? So, love story, prophecy. So far, we're seeing great parallels between what happened at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Egypt situation and what's happening when the Jewish people first get into the land of Israel in the time of Yoshua. Okay. Now the similarities grow, but so do the differences. And in order to understand that, we're going to take a couple of minutes and we're going to jump back to the book of Bereshit and the creation of the world. And we're going to just highlight some key terms that we actually didn't focus on when we talked about creation. The first term is tehom. The hoshech al panei tehom. Anybody have a sense of what that means?
Emptiness.
Emptiness, the abyss, emptiness, right? How do we physically picture tehom? Where is it? It's at the depths of the deepest sea. So if there is a physical tehom, this abyss, this emptiness, we physically engage it in the depths of the deepest sea. Good. What does the term Yabasha mean? Anybody remember? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu ends up separating the waters, creating Yabasha. What is it?
Dry land.
It's dry land. And Abe, what type of dry land is it? Ultimately, as the process of Bereshit goes on. It's ultimately completely fertile, right? It's the land that the plant kingdom grows on, is built from. So therefore, whenever we see the word tehom, we're talking about emptiness and abyss. Whenever we see the word yabasha, we're talking about something incredibly fertile and lush and beautiful. Okay, so far?
And it's at the same core.
Beautiful.
It's from the same core.
Grand slam. Hold that point for a few minutes.
Emptiness and fertile.
Hold that point for a few minutes.
Wow.
Beautiful. What does yam mean? What does yam mean?
Water.
Water.
The sea?
Okay, now, the me hayam means the water in the yam. Mayim in the yam. What does yam mean? Huh? No, that's the whole point. Sea, if we call yam the sea, then in our minds we see water. So the me hayam is the sea. What does yam mean? Yam means a crevice, emptiness, a hole, a canyon, something that ultimately could get filled with water. Okay? So from the story of Bereshit, we're going to pull out the terms tehom, which is abyss, and for our purposes, let's imagine that abyss at the deepest part of the deepest ocean. Yabasha, which is dry land, and we're talking about the dry land that was absolutely fertile and full. And finally, the term yam, which doesn't mean sea or ocean. It means crevice or giant hole that ultimately gets filled by water. Good.
And what is Yam Suf?
Beautiful. That's the name of that specific area, was called the Reed Sea.
Uh-huh.
So the reed crevice, you'd call it, and if you said beautiful, if you said Me Yam Suf, it would be the waters of the Reed Sea. Good. Now, when we look at the splitting of the sea, this is story number 3, and then we'll begin to tie all the pieces together. When we look at the Reed Sea and the story of the splitting of the sea, anybody remember some of the key terms? I'm gonna say them to you. Sus v'rochevo rama bayam. What does that mean? Sus v'rochevo rama bayam.
The
The horses
carried
heel.
The horses and the chariots, yeah.
Was swallowed by the sea?
Rama. What does Rama mean, Zeke?
Doesn't it mean
Rama.
tricked?
What, Serena?
Tricked?
Serene?
Tricked. Wasn't it? Is
No,
it
what is
Rama?
Rama? The Harim.
Oh, I guess high up. They were
raised. Beautiful.
Raised.
Beautiful. So sus v'rochevo rama bayam. What does that mean? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when the Egyptians entered the water, he took their chariots, threw them up, and then brought them down.
Uh-huh.
Now, let's go through the rest of the story. What happens? The Egyptians are chasing the Jews. The Jews have nowhere to go, so to speak, but to jump in the water. Moshe Rabbeinu raises his staff and points it to where? To the yam, to the crevice, not to the water, to the crevice. When he points it to the crevice, the tehom, what's on the deepest part of the water, begins to rise up. So the floor of the sea begins to rise up. What would you guess happens when the floor is rising up? Sari, what would happen?
You could walk on the water.
1 second, not yet.
No,
Not yet.
People
What
like-
happens?
the people, the chariot dries up.
The water is getting displaced, right? When the tehom, when the base of the water of the sea is coming up, now the water is getting displaced. Now, The water gets displaced. Okay, it could have
What
just
is
run
this
off
space? Like,
onto
like
the
a,
dry
like
land.
a tsunami? What is the space?
Beautiful, beautiful, like a tsunami. Exactly like a tsunami. Fantastic. The shell, the bottom, the plate at the bottom of the sea is rising up. There's no place for the water to go. The water can be displaced. The water can be like it was in the tsunami, right? Giant, giant waves. Or with God's miracles, it splits and becomes two walls. Now, the Egyptians can't see any of this because the black cloud of smoke is in between us and the Egyptians. So the Jewish people now walk on this surface, right? The Tehom came up. Now the Jewish people can walk right in. They walk on the flat surface. The water is in an orderly fashion on either side of them. And the Egyptians don't see any problem. So what do? They go right in. They say, well, maybe this crevice was filled up. Maybe it's not a problem because the Jews seem to be moving. As the Egyptians walk in, their portion of the Tehom that rose up crumbles. They shoot down, are thrown up, and meet their deaths. So the Tehom that rose up to be the Yabashah, to be the dry land that the Jewish people are walking on, that the Egyptians assumed they would walk on, crumbles. The Egyptians walk out into the sea, fall down, get thrown up by the power of God, Sus Rochvo Rama Bayam, and then get hurled down to their deaths.
Wanted us to come up.
Okay, beautiful.
I remember hearing something about that. Hashem wanted them to know in their time of dying that the way it happened was even unnatural somehow. The way,
He wanted them to know it was unnatural.
right?
Exactly. And he also wanted to show the world something. What was he showing the world by doing? By doing it in this type of exaggerated way, what was he showing the world? Esther, what do you say? What might he have been showing the world by doing this?
How powerful he is.
Yeah, how powerful he is. And
Don't mess with my people.
Don't mess with my people. And and what else?
He's in control.
He's in control. And what else? He brought in Tehom, Yabashah, and Yam. What does he want to demonstrate?
That he's the master of
what? Of what?
everything.
Nature.
Yeah.
Of nature
The
and
changing
great
forces of nature.
and
The
that
world.
he is the creator.
Right.
He is the creator. What essentially the Jewish people saw at the splitting of the sea, when you add that to the plagues, they effectively saw God's creation all over again. So what does God do to sort of speed through the creative process in a way that the world would see and take note of? He takes the Tehom, which is lifeless, which is black, which is at the bottom of the deepest sea. He brings it up, instantly gives it life, and makes it flourish with fertilization and plants and trees and so on, completely spontaneously. Has the Jewish people walk on that, keeps the Egyptians back on the other part, which crumbles as they come onto it. And if you would think they would simply fall, they fall, they're thrown up, and they're brought down to the Kadosh Baruch Hu shows that he controls the whole story. Gravity doesn't mean anything. Nothing else means anything. Okay? So far, so good? So, what was the point of the splitting of the sea? To cap off the rest of the experience where the world and the Jewish people would see the greatness of God. Good. And then they sing about it. Now, what happens in the book of Joshua?
I'm
far-
looking,
Huh?
I'm looking at it as Hashem told him to take off your shoes and reveal yourself to become natural and to become the core of yourself.
Beautiful.
And that's how I'm looking at the water, that he showed the core of the water before it became water.
Okay, okay. So keep going with that. Keep building on that. What happens in the book of Joshua? I'm going to give you a hint. In the book of Shemot, God splits the sea. In the book of Joshua, the river splits.
Wow.
Right. So let's see what's going on here. Who needs a river splitting? We already got the headline, right? We got an ocean splitting, a sea, not an ocean, but a sea splitting, right? So what happens? The Jewish people approach the land of Israel. As they're approaching the land of Israel, Elliot Shalmei, what happens when they approach? What stops when they're approaching the land?
What, meaning the water?
What
And
stops,
Moshe-
honey? What? The
When
water?
Moshe splits it, when the wind?
No. What stops when they approach the land? In terms of what the Jewish people enjoyed in the desert, what stops?
Oh, meaning when they run out of water?
Your grandma answered the question now. The man and the cloud covering, right? The man, right?
yeah.
Free food every day, and the cloud
Oh,
covering, right? From all
Yeah, the
sides,
man.
top, right? The Be'er of Miriam, also the water stops, right? Everything stops. Now it's about living in the real world. They get to the Jordan River. Joshua, using almost identical terminology that Hakadosh Baruch Hu used with Moshe, is used with Joshua. But one thing is different here. Just to qualify, so it's important to know, a lot of us have been in the Jordan River, right? Some of us have been there together. And these days, the Jordan River doesn't get all that strong. And that's because everybody is siphoning off Syrians, the Lebanese, the Israelis, everybody siphons off water from the Jordan River. But in ancient times, the Jordan River would thrust forward with strong current, particularly in Nisan. The Jewish people enter the land of Israel in the 10th of Nisan. So particularly in the 10th of Nisan, when the snow is melting, right? You're talking about April, May. The snow is melting. The water is gushing through. At that point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells them, you're going to cross the river. Now, anybody remember the story? And you guys tell me, what is the point here? We cross the ocean. We know the connection with Joshua. We know he's got the goods. Why do we have to cross something? By the way, it's a river. What are we doing here? What do you say? Any thoughts? Serene, what do you think?
Maybe we're testing the Jews' faith in God.
Excellent. How are we testing it? What was different here? You're absolutely right.
Maybe they couldn't rely on a miracle.
Excellent. Perfect. Now the game is completely changed. The man stops. The Ananei Kavod stops. The Be'er Mayim stops. Now we're in a very different reality. Now HaKadosh Baruch Hu turns to the Kohanim and he tells them, take the Aron, take the main case that carried the Torah and the Luchot, take the Aron, step into the water, and the water will split. And it will be not two walls as it was in Kiryat Yamsuf, but it'll be one wall. Now, in this case, there's an overt miracle for sure in what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did by having the water stand up on one side when the Kohanim step in. But in this case, it's very different. To Serene's point, now we're working together on this. Now we're partnering. Now it's not HaKadosh Baruch Hu is creating miracles and everybody else is hanging out. If you remember the class on Tefillat Chana that we did a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Chana, in that prayer / prophecy, articulated the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Kadosh. Hashem is Kadosh, but the uniqueness of his Kedusha, which means separateness, is that he can fully engage the human being and be fully engaged by him. But now we come through this whole period where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling the Jewish people, We're one people. You're with me. We're partners. We have a relationship. You have the most intimate of relationships with me. And then he goes and he does everything on his own. But now we have the generation, the children of the desert. These people did the moving from one place to another, right? 42 different stops. And our rabbis say maybe they actually moved 42 times and maybe they didn't. But the names attached to those stops are to denote growth from one phase to another in the desert. And we'll talk about that at some point in the future. Now you have a people who was up to a level of confidence and trust and love of God, where they walked into the dynamic river and they stood there and the water stopped.
Did they not have to enter? Did they not walk in first and then it split, or it split first?
Beautiful.
They walked in first.
They walked in first. That's
So
exactly.
that's even more of a faith in
That's
Hashem.
exactly the point. They had to walk in first. So now we're talking about a different reality, right? We're talking about a reality where God is not checked out. God is still very involved, but we have that connection. So it's not going to be free miracle time. It's not going to be God stepping out time. This is going to be the paradigm, the prototype for what will stay forever. These people, the children of the generation of the desert, are called the greatest Jewish generation of all time. Imagine the whole book of Yoshua. There's one person who's called out as having sinned. A person who took from the bounty of the city of Yericho, he took small nothing things and hid them when Yoshua said that all of the bounty has to go to the Mishkan, has to go to God. The only person in the entire 20 some odd years of Yoshua's kingship, one person is called out as having failed, having sinned. It's unprecedented. But Yoshua was the ultimate leader. Our rabbis say that Moshe Rabbeinu was the sun and Yoshua was the moon. And we know that the sun and the moon started out as equals. And only at some period of time, the moon shrinks a little bit in its power. But in practical terms, our rabbis say, yes, a lot of it is copy-paste, but copy-paste with the major caveat of now we're involved. Now, you would say, just build that from all the wars that Joshua won so successfully. Every war just about was a great victory, disproportionately so. Not the same. Because even if we tried to prove God's greatness and connectedness to the Jewish people through these resounding successes of the wars, which Israel won, the children of Israel won disproportionately, it wouldn't have hearkened us back to the splitting of the sea, which wouldn't have pulled us back to the creation of the world. And it wouldn't have tied all the pieces together. That God, that omnipotent entity that created the world, that stands in an absolute separate reality, you know what? That God gave me all kinds of miracles for decades, right? 4 decades in the desert. But when the miracles stopped, the relationship got stronger. The relationship got better because it gave us a chance to express ourselves. When Yoshua steps outside of himself, Shal Na'alecha, he does it even more quickly than Moshe Rabbeinu does. He has the courage to take a lady who showed great bravery, but otherwise lived a very different kind of lifestyle than he did. He was the Misharet of Moshe Rabbeinu. He never left his side. And he marries her. They say that Yoshua was the most loving leader that Israel ever had. Nobody loved his people as much as Yoshua. Imagine, even with Achan, the one person who's called out as having sinned during Yoshua's entire tenure, even Achan, when he reaches out to him, his words to him are not chastising. They're not harsh. They're loving. They're heartbroken because he sees that he sinned and he would have to be punished for that sin. And he was heartbroken to have to deal with that, not looking for retribution. So, what does this say to all of us? A, the book of Joshua, the book of Joshua is a great read. It's 21 chapters. It's easy to get through. It's worth reading, as are all the prophets. And as we go on, we're going to connect more and more between the Chumash and the prophets. B, the upcoming story of the splitting of the sea is a testimony to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness. But it was limited because the Jewish people were totally passive. And so they sin almost immediately thereafter. They start complaining, they start rebelling because they were totally passive. They didn't have to sacrifice, they didn't have to give, they didn't have to partner, they didn't have to build, they just stood still. Any relationship, as we all know, if one of the partners is passive, doesn't go very far. When the Jewish people were told to step up, to Abi's point, when they stepped into the raging waters of the Jordan River, when they stepped up and they could look at themselves and say, we collaborated with the miracle, we partnered with the miracle, that emboldened and that maintained and that safeguarded the generation that is known as the greatest generation in Jewish history. And the roadmap that provides us is wonderful. It's beautiful. And we'll wrap up with this, and you guys will have any thoughts or questions. The roadmap is that the awareness of God on the planet is category A. We need to become more and more and more aware, but the awareness doesn't suggest passivity. Some people, as they become more learning and more in their learning, more connected to mitzvot, more connected to the halacha, more connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, become more passive and say, you know what? HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's all true. But the opposite is the plan. The opposite. You can't read the book of Shemot without reading the book of Yoshua. The book of Shemot produced a good generation. The book of Yoshua produced the greatest generation. How do we get it? By partnership, by sacrifice, by knowing and doing, and having the top of mind. And the top of mind is about action, 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 pushing. I got to do more. I want to do more. Push, try, use the closeness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what the book of Yoshua teaches us. And that's the way that we manifest the relationship with God as overtly as possible. And that's what we want. Good. Thoughts, questions?
I have one question, correct. Can you say that they weren't necessarily given the opportunity in Mitzrayim for the partnership, so to speak, right? Like it wasn't as if Hashem said effectively, you take off your shoes and get it. And so it almost sets them up to fail in that respect, if you think about it.
Yeah, I think coming from a slave mentality, they didn't have a shot at partnering.
Right, so he felt they weren't ready to go.
Yeah, he felt they weren't ready and they had to be babied, so to speak. And it worked and didn't work. It worked somewhat and didn't work somewhat.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah. But it took a tremendous amount of growth on that generation's part in order to understand it. But they then wrote it all down and they left it to us on a silver platter. Compare the stories and assess each person's relationship with God. Is it a relationship based on action? Is it a relationship based on partnership? To think that I can be partners with God, I don't know. We don't use those terms too often. They don't demand us to turn our lives upside down. No, they enable us to look at life differently. as God is my partner. And with God as the partner, there's almost nothing that shouldn't be. And that's what we want. We want the generation of Joshua. He marries. Wow. How did he see the greatness in her? But he did. He did. How did he see the greatness in his people? He did. How did they see the greatness in themselves? They did, even though their parents didn't. Yeah. Serene?
Yeah. So if you're saying that Yehoshua's generation was the greatest generation of Jews, was the Shoftim considered, when the Shoftim came after Yehoshua, was that considered a downgrade, or was that considered?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
had that happen if they were such a great generation?
So we're going to actually talk about that. What exactly happened at that time, and what happened, why it happened to our understanding, and what it set for us going forward. We're gonna speak about that in depth, but you're absolutely right. There was a giant decline during the time of the Shoftim, giant decline, and it wasn't necessarily recouped during the time of the kings either. So we have to talk about what went wrong in that mix,
Right.
in that porridge, so to speak, and what we took from it and what we changed from it. And I want to tell you that the galut, the diaspora, was in certain respects an antidote and a cure and a fixer-upper for what happened there. As we said last week, the galut is not a punishment. The galut is an important step in the process. And part of rebuilding and repairing and becoming that didn't happen during the time of the Shoftim, of the judges, that could have but didn't, happens afterwards, after we're thrown out of the land. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the key elements of the time of the judges, some of the key elements of the time of the kings. We're going to do sort of a quick overview of the books of Shoftim and Menachim, and then we're going to talk about how some of that was fixed in the diaspora that we're all in currently.
Great, thank you.
Right.
Was it Yeshua's granddaughter's husband that greeted at the wall of the city with the pitchers of water?
Yeah, isn't that nice? It's Shalom
So-
ben Tikva is his name, right?
So isn't there a parallel with that the granddaughter's husband is using the water, which was the element of the partnership?
Very nice, unreal. I didn't think of that, but I think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful,
And
I don't
that's
know-
why she was great.
and that's why she was. I don't know the answer to this, so maybe you guys can think about it. But the rabbis say that the reason that Huldah became a prophetess is because her husband was so kind and giving, because he stood at the gates of the city day and night, greeting travelers, sojourners, giving them water and helping them.
It's almost
Because-
like Abraham Avinu.
Right? Okay. But because of his actions, she becomes great, which I thought was fascinating. And I don't absolutely understand why he didn't become great. But it appears that his greatness, to your point, Lisa, his greatness was articulated the way he did it. But somehow it was overflowing, so to speak, to the point where his wife, who wasn't necessarily on his level, becomes one of the handful of female prophets in Jewish history, which suggests something very interesting. We know
What was her name? What was her name?
what was
Her name.
her name. 1 second. Is
The
Huldah.
wife's name.
Yeah,
Huldah.
Huldah. Yeah. We know the following. We know that the shefa, that abundance, beracha, comes through the wife, right? We know that. We know that that's how HaKadosh Baruch Hu does his thing, right? If there's beracha in the love, in the marriage, then the abundance flows through the wife, right? You can all take credit for all the good stuff that goes on in your families. To say that the opposite is also true, that the husband's greatness would build the wife, is another interesting thing. In other words, the love, a happy love, doesn't only bring shefa, beracha from God through the wife, but a successful husband in his outstanding chesed, let's say in this case, will enable the wife to grow to levels that she may not even have, she certainly wouldn't have reached on her own. So it shows a remarkable connectedness between people who are close. It's true between spouses, it's true between siblings, where the actions of one will bring God's attention to add a great level of beracha to the life of the other. And I think it's just a very interesting thing to think about. Not only do we love our children, not only do we love the people close to us, but when we grow in a certain way, if that growth is exceptional, if it's more than typical, well, then it drags down additional beracha, additional blessing to the people around us. And that's what the Chodah and the Shalom story tells us.
Beautiful.
Good. Elliot
Thank you.
Shalmei, what do you got?
Thank you, Ricky.
Okay,
Very
thank
nice,
you,
thank
Lord.
you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Mark, any questions, thoughts? Great to have you, Mark.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
I was gonna
Thanks, Ricky.
say,
Thank you,
Yes.
everybody.
Thank you, Ricky.
All right, all the
Thank you,
best,
Ricky.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you,
I love
Ricky.
the ending. The
God
ending was
bless you.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Ricky.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.